honored to be sitting on this panel with 5 really great people who've done a lot of innovative work, and we're just going to keep this conversation going and build on, the themes of discretion and how every decision you guys make at each step of the way, or the decisions that are made, really impact the overall problem. So we're going to, take this on home and focus on sentencing, prison, and reentry. So we're going to be talking to Judge Marcucci of Denver, and again, all of their bios are in your folders, but just briefly introduce them. Secretary Wetzel and Carrie Amon of Pennsylvania. We have Fred Patrick of the Vera Institute of Justice in New York, and LaShawna Thompson-L is an advocate here in D.C. So while they're all speaking, I just want everyone to think about, as was mentioned in earlier panels, really think about why we incarcerate people. And I ask you that, thinking through these things, I'd like to offer one possible solution to mass incarceration, which is redefining the purpose of incarceration and realigning it with our values, and then actually applying that with our policies. So thinking in this framework, hopefully then we can shrink the system overall, which can be one solution in and of itself to this problem of mass incarceration, but also enhance the administration of justice and focus on the quality of justice and not simply the number of people we shuffle in and out of our system. So with that, Judge, I'm going to start with you. When, as a member of the courtroom in the black robe, how do you think about mass incarceration when you go to sentence somebody, or what decisions go through your mind when you're looking at somebody in front of you?
We've been talking about how many people I've sentenced, and certainly it's been over a couple 100,000 over 27 years. So, there's a lot of things that have gone through my mind. But I want to reflect back a little bit. About 12 years ago, I was reassigned to the jail courtroom. And in there, I would see folks, repeatedly over and over and over again. And I'm thinking, how can we possibly keep these people from coming back? I mean, that's what we're all here to talk about today. So we pulled some numbers over a 5-year period of time, the top 500 folks that we had contacted, and we found out that we had actually cited, arrested them, charged them 17,000 times over a 5-year period. So the comment was made earlier about the thief, the 30 cases. Our average of those folks was 34 cases over a 5-year period of time. When we talk about the person with 30 or more offenses, we found that we had over 1,800 folks in our system that had those kinds of records. And invariably, I would look at them and I'd say, you were in a lot of trouble until about 10 years ago. In the last 3 years, we've seen you. And of course, I found out over a period of time that that's because they had all been in prison. So the only break in their incarceration in my courtroom, the city jail, was their time in the Department of Corrections. And it led me to the conclusion that the consequences of all those prior arrests had not sought the consequence that we were actually trying to achieve, which was not to bring them back into our system. So we started to develop some new thinking and to break down the barriers. We talk about the barriers to success, but the one thing we had to do was break down the barriers that have infected our judicial system for so long, and how we can convince the judges to try to change this cycle. I think in my early training, the constant mantra was, we're not social workers, John. And yet, when I look back now over my last 27 years, and I've talked to a lot of prosecutors, judges, and I've heard this over and over again, and the truth is, we really are social workers. The Ronald Reagan years and thereafter released all of the folks out of the mental health institutions, and they ended up in our jails. So we're learning that we really need to be social workers, and we need that constant impact at the front end. So those 17,000 arrests, we started to call those front-end users. And I'll just give you, I don't know how long I'm supposed to talk here, but just a couple things that we've done. Just a recent program, and I know in Red Hook they have the community court, and I don't know what it's called now, but we tried to model that in Denver, and it really didn't work very well. 4 months ago, we took we opened the courtroom in a shelter. itself. So we have two main shelters. One runs by the Protestant, one's run by the Catholic Church. They're across the street from one another. In the first state session, this was a voluntary court. So if you got a citation, you had a charge pending, you weren't in jail, you could just walk in. And we did 480 cases in our first state sessions, which turns out to be about 8% of our overall annual docket for those types of offenses are now, and these are homeless, down and out folks. So I'll make just maybe one other comment. You know, the talk about violent versus nonviolent. I've had many I was the chief of our judicial system for 6 years. It's about 38 judicial officers. And the thing about violent, nonviolent. So the typical guy, a lot of them are males, usually people of color. You know, they get out of prison and then they end right back in our system, right, cycling through. And we just started to come up with some programs, but the prosecutors kept saying, well, this guy's a violent criminal, so he's not eligible. And I started to convince them, you know, the 53-year-old released from prison, and the 53-year-old guy who lost his job when he was 45 and maybe hasn't gone to prison, but they're both living under the bridge, right? And they're 53 and they're panhandling and they're the kind of people we see every day. So are we really going to rehabilitate the 53-year-old homeless guy living under the bridge with maybe has lost 2/3 of his teeth? Are we going to rehabilitate him back into a bank robber? And the answer is no, we're not. So one of the things we've done is try to open all of our programs to even people with the most serious violent criminal past. Well, again, these are low offending charges. So these are some of the things that we've looked at over a period of time to try to reassess our overuse of incarceration, because we all know that whether you give a guy 10 years or 5 years, on the 5 years and 1 day, the guy you gave 10 years to, he doesn't say on, you know, in that 6th year, well, now I'm going to change. But if they'd only given me 5 years, I wouldn't have. You know, the incarceration is really not meeting our goals. So.
That's a perfect segue. You know, you talk about the shuffling in and out of our system, and the only time when people weren't before you when they were in facilities, which sort of, you know, begs the question, well, what was happening while they were locked up? Were they just locked up behind bars, or they have access to programs? Because, you know, maybe we need to, again, reevaluate what we're doing in our prisons. And earlier we were talking about the importance of investing in people and giving them an opportunity. So Secretary Wetzel, you are a pioneer kind of in reforming corrections policies. Some will call you a pioneer. Can you just tell us a little bit about your philosophy and kind of what you've been doing to make sure that when people leave your facilities, they get out and they stay out?
All right, the pioneer thing freaked me out a little bit, so you threw me off my square there for a minute. Well, I think for me, there's two values that we really have to start with. And the first one is just acknowledging the humanity of everyone who comes in our system. And along with that, and this part we lose, that an individual's humanity isn't diminished by any act that they do, right? And how we treat them says a hell of a lot more about us than it says about them. And I think you've really got to start with that. And it's especially important, and I think it's especially relevant today, when we're now in the midst of this opioid epidemic, and we're hearing a changing narrative. And I say this to say that I think we have a real opportunity. And you know, we can all speculate on the changing narrative and why, as I travel around the state with Governor Wolf, doing roundtables, I hear law enforcement officials and business leaders and educators and people who run hospitals saying we can't incarcerate our way out of this. We need to treat people. These are our brothers and sisters. And certainly anytime you have a criminal justice conversation, race is always one of the elephants in the room. But I simplify things a little more than that. I would tell you that the only way that as a country you can incarcerate 2.3 million people is if you don't value that humanity. The only way that's possible is because we're doing that to them. And if you're them, you're in trouble, right? Any setting. But I think the opportunity that this opioid epidemic, as horrible as it is, the opportunity it gives us is that for the first time, we have people, decision makers, policymakers, who are personally impacted, and we have a system that's predicated on the assumption that jail is the default, that the criminal justice system, if you fall through a crack in any system, on the other end of that chasm is a jail, period. So I think we have a real opportunity. I think the second core value that really needs to drive what we do is the belief in mankind's ability to change. And if you don't have those two things, you can't do anything. But we have a lot of programs, and Carrie is one of our superstars who I was fortunate enough to inherit in the Department of Corrections. The governor's office recently stole her. I got outranked. But I'm going to talk about some of the stuff we've done specifically around workforce. But I got to tell you, when we have this conversation about overuse of incarceration in response to crime and reform, and we don't talk about disparate economic opportunities in the communities most affected, we don't talk about disparate educational opportunities, if we're not talking about nurse-family partnership and pre-K and early childhood education to get kids who are starting 10 yards behind in a 100-yard race, if we don't focus on getting them to be like reading, for me it's this simple. I looked at black kids in Pennsylvania, and I know if a young black man drops out of school, they have a 70% lifetime likelihood of being incarcerated. And I know this, that if they're reading at grade level by grade 3, they're less likely to drop out, which means they're less likely to be incarcerated. So we can't have these conversations without talking about the community. Now, listen, I believe that we have to have much better environments inside our prisons. We have to own our outcomes. We have to expect people in my position to focus on outcomes, right? I mean, I think that's critical. We haven't historically. And if you look at systems that have a 40% recidivism rate and bragging about it, or 20%, even 20% recidivism rate and bragging about it, I would ask you a simple question. If I give you 2 free tickets to Hawaii and said 8 out of 10 times your plane's gonna land, who's getting on that damn plane, right? You're not getting on that plane. So part of it is we have to do outcomes, and that means the conditions of confinement and to expect that we make harsh environments inside prisons and people are gonna come out being ready to be self-actualized is just foolhardy. We have to understand that people come to us with a skill deficit, but this conversation has to start by building those skills before they engage in our system. And from a conservative standpoint, we wanna spend money once. When government has to touch a person, doesn't it make sense to spend money once? And the magic about this is the earlier on we spend it, the earlier on we identify when we need to spend it, the better the outcomes are, and it's cheaper. And it's cheaper from a fiscal standpoint, but more importantly, the other thing that gets lost in this conversation is the amount of children impacted by incarceration. 1 in 7 poor kids have a parent incarcerated. 81,000 children in Pennsylvania have a parent incarcerated in a state prison. So we have an opportunity to change this trajectory. A key piece of that, in our case, is having people come out with the ability, with skills that they can actually get a job. But I gotta tell you, 2 days ago I was in Harrisburg, DC, with some other leaders of corrections agencies from Alabama, from Utah, from Kentucky, and hearing about a phenomenon that's going on right now where we have business leaders, CEOs, reaching out, especially in the manufacturing realm, reaching out to corrections directors saying, is there some way you can start building this skill set? Because we need welders. We need skills in manufacturing. So I'm gonna throw it to Carrie if you can talk about some of the workforce stuff.
Sure, yeah. Secretary Wetzel, under his leadership, we do a lot of assessment of really truly understanding the individuals that are in the state prisons in Pennsylvania. And so looking at this profile, we recognize and understand that like 80% of the people coming into a state prison in Pennsylvania lack skills, right? They report that they have no skill base. The numbers on GED, high school degree attainment, are dismal. Reading, math skill, literacies are poor. And so when we expect people to be able to walk out of a state prison and re-engage and reconnect and re-enter, whatever you want to call it, with the community without having that connection, right? Because incarceration somehow draws this line that they're not part of the community anymore. And so we've really tried to look at ways to understand and really put our policies and the investments and our connections so that these are individuals that are still connected to their community and they're still a part of their community regardless of where they're currently residing and if it's in the state prison system. And so on the workforce development realm, I would not consider myself a criminal justice practitioner by trade. I come from a workforce development and education background and landed in corrections probably by happenstance. I was Secretary's policy staff person, focused on reentry, but also just a heavy grant-making development manager inside. And so what we recognized was we were doing a lot about treatment. We were talking a lot about restrictive housing and things. We weren't talking a lot about education and training and how we set up those pathways behind the walls and in reaching out and pulling those individuals with a transition and a network into the community. So we had this huge opportunity to secure some funding through a competitive grant at the U.S. Department of Education that really looked at building on some existing contracts that the Secretary really envisioned. And they're reentry service contracts where we put money out on the street to support service delivery for benefits on education and training prior to release that connected post-release. They're on things like a forklift training. This isn't your traditional teach someone how to do a resume prior to when they get out, right? And so we've been utilizing this grant opportunity to leverage. You have a parallel system, right? Criminal justice practitioners in Pennsylvania said, we really need to engage employers. We really need to understand what training opportunities are out there, what's in demand. There's a whole workforce system and education system dedicated to doing that, right? So how do we start to build those connections? I happen to come from that system, and so really putting and positioning the department in a way where they can start to build those connections and support it through policy development, support it with planning, support it with the governor's office really taking a stance and saying corrections has a seat at the table just as much as our education department does, just as much as our workforce and labor and industry department does and so forth. Right.
Let me just add one real specific example of existing funding, because we always go, oh, we don't have money. No, we don't have the will to find a way to get money, right? And let me tell you just a real specific, we got a grant to do a study on traumatic brain injury, right? And we were the third system in the country, I believe, to do it. And what we did is we targeted people going back to Philadelphia, which is our big supplier, right? 27% of everybody comes in our door comes from Philadelphia in their last year. So we were screening people. We found an incidence rate of about 60% who met the criteria for traumatic brain injury, which is consistent with the other two studies. But what that does is it makes you eligible for Office of Vocational Rehab resources to include things like job coaching, right? So just because we did the work to identify folks, we're able to plug them into Office of Vocational Rehab, who has federal money filtered through the state for this group. But when we think of people in context of one thing, we think of someone as an inmate or a returning citizen, whatever damn label you want to use. We're always going to come up short. If we think of as an individual who has needs and look at what system makes the most sense to meet those needs, then we can start doing stuff and breaking down some of these walls. So I just want to add that as a real specific and relatively simple example on finding funding in other ways other than just focusing on this person committed a crime, and so the only system that can service them is the criminal justice system.
Thank you. That's actually a perfect segue. Because that really hits home at focusing on the humanity aspect of it, right? And thinking outside of the box into how can we actually set somebody up for success when they leave these doors so they never have to come back again. So with that, Fred, I'm going to turn it over to you a little bit. And, at Vera, you guys are working on this Reimagining Prisons initiative. Can you tell us about that and kind of how it came to life?
So with reimagining, first I want to go back to what Kim Ball said earlier and what's been a sort of running theme throughout today, and that's discretion. So when one thinks about the definition of discretion, you could say it's the freedom to decide, the ability to make the responsible decision. And so at Vera, in 2016, we were thinking about how do we mark the 10-year anniversary of the release of the report Confronting Confinement, which was released by the Commission on Safety and Abuse in America's Prison. That commission had started in 2005. Vera brought together a very diverse group of individuals, formerly incarcerated, judges, U.S. attorneys, reentry experts, and they began to look at the conditions of confinement, the safety and abuse in America's prisons. And it was the first deep dive, extensive look at conditions in America's prisons since the Attica riots. And what that commission found in its report, released again in June of 2006, was, and this will sound very familiar, too much violence in facilities, poor and inadequate health care, lack of external accountability and transparency, not enough data collection around how prisons operate. Sounds familiar, these themes? So now it's 2017. And so, but if we go back to the summer of 2016, we were thinking about what's the best way to sort of honor the work of the commission, because that commission's report, what it did was sort of help lead to what's now this national momentum, and John is at the forefront, as Secretary Wetzel, of reducing the use of solitary confinement. One of the other findings, in addition to the ones that I talked about, was the overuse of solitary confinement, then mostly called segregation or restrictive housing. And so, as a result of that report and the spotlight on that, correctional leaders all across the U.S., and Vera partnered with quite a few of them, began to really take a look at the extent to which what had started as this rare practice, to the extent it had become this very commonplace practice, the notion of locking people up with limited human contact for 22, 23 hours a day, and the fact that it was increasingly becoming a default response to all manner of behavior. So who you think is in solitary in 2016, 2017 is not quite, who's actually there is not quite who you would think. So it was no longer being used for the notion of someone who assaulted or stabbed a fellow incarcerated person or a staff member. In the states we've worked at over the years, we've found things like individuals are there, and sometimes for extended periods, for talking back to officers, for failing to report to work detail, for having too many pillowcases, and for smoking in the systems that have banned it. And so it was important through that commission that we were able to sort of take a deep dive look. And so again, taking you back summer 16, what did we want to do with that anniversary? We thought about, do we commission a few reports from commission members to talk about what they found 10 years earlier and what problems still exist? Do we do a big convening, something like this, and have a bunch of terrific speakers talk about where we should go and the road still far ahead? And instead we decided, well, maybe since we seem to be in the middle of this emerging, and some would say growing consensus around mass incarceration or over-incarceration, that too many people are locked up, we began to talk about the fact that lots of that discussion, which is about sentencing reform and front-end diversion and policing, that much of that discussion was void of how we treat individuals who are in the system. When we talk about mass incarceration, it tends to be about the numbers. And we decided that it was worth thinking about, do you want a system that's simply smaller, even if it's significantly smaller, but that operates exactly as it does? Is that what people mean when they say they want to end mass incarceration? I think not. So we saw this as an opportunity to say, while we're in this era where people are focused on the overuse of incarceration and how that eats into taxpayer dollars, that now's the time to also engage the entire American citizenry and all the stakeholders therein around the notion of what do we attempt to accomplish when we incarcerate? What are we hoping to achieve? And we've decided to, since that point, since June of last year, we've been embarked upon this collective engagement process. We've had focus groups and convenings with incarcerated individuals inside prisons, formerly incarcerated individuals, correctional leaders, crime victims, prosecutors, judges, conservative thought leaders here in D.C. a couple of weeks ago with Mark and some other conservative and libertarian thought leaders. But the whole notion of talking to our American citizenry around what are we seeking to accomplish? Even if we have this radically reduced system, which we're all hopeful that we have, what are we trying to do? And should it be about safety and accountability and restoration and redemption and hope, going back to your earlier point about the values. What are the underlying values that should undergird the system? And then what does that mean operationally? If you say you want a system that, one, does no harm, which should always be a first principle, that, two, is grounded in transparency, that, three, is premised on the notion that the loss of liberty is the punishment. Is there a need for a prison system to do further punishment? What does it mean to have a system where we give people the opportunity and the skills to get education and training such that they go home and succeed and never come back? Does the system that we have today operate along that premise? Most would argue not. Now, granted, are there some wonderful beacons of light and opportunity in the American system? Yeah. But the other thing we did was we thought about some of the earlier work we did around comparative corrections. John, in 2013, was a part of a delegation, he and other correctional leaders from across the country, that Vera took to look at prisons in Germany and the Netherlands. And some of the things there, I think, resonated. If I recall, John was very impressed about a lot of the natural lighting compared to a lot of our dark facilities here in the U.S. John also, if I recall, one of the statements was, you said you were like, it was a light bulb going off when one of the leaders in one of the German facilities talked about that. His statement, and it's a powerful statement, was that public safety, good public safety, is really the logical consequence of a good correctional system, not the other way around. And so it's really about, reimagining at the end of the day is about how do you engage all of us, the community writ large, in thinking about what's the purpose of incarceration and thinking about what we attempt to achieve when we send people to prison and jail. And granted, it should be sending fewer people to jail, we should be. But what are we hoping to accomplish? And then once we have a collective vision of that, how do we then operationalize that and ensure that our prisons and jails operate accordingly?
Thank you. Yeah, you know, it's really, it's time to, you know, I think what we've seen throughout the day is focusing on discretions and decisions is really needs to take a step back and rethink kind of our whole system and what we're doing. Is it working? Is it not working? Where are there successes? Where are there shortcomings? And how can we change those? So, LaShawn, I just want to turn to you for a minute. As a returning citizen, can you tell us a little bit about what has made it able for you to get out, stay out? What was helpful? What's been missing? What other policies should be in place to make it easier and more beneficial for people who are coming out of either jail or prison?
Thank you, Genevieve, for having me, and thank you everybody who stuck around after a very long day to hear from us. I'm really honored to be on this panel with such great people with such beautiful minds. I think I first want to say that I don't propose to speak on behalf of all returning citizens, because most returning citizens are really concerned about the fact that people think there's a cookie-cutter response for reentry and that reentry looks the same for everybody. So I've been home I was released in 2011, so I've been home for 6 years now. And I served 18 years. 13 of those years was in the Federal Bureau of Prisons because I'm from D.C., and even though it was a local crime, we don't have a prison system. So I spent my first 5 years here in D.C. at CTF, and then the last 13 in the Federal Bureau of Prisons. So one of the things that was, I think, a huge part of my success was my opportunity to re-engage with my community. So D.C. for me is a really community-based place to live, because people just tend to be more involved from a social perspective in terms of when young people make mistakes and young people go away and when they reintegrate. But one of the biggest challenges that I always talk about when I speak, because I was blessed to be able to find employment, living wage employment, through the mayor's office and the Corrections Information Council, and I was able to complete my undergraduate degree through Trinity Washington University after accumulating a lot of credits while I was incarcerated. But I even obtained affordable housing, which is really a big deal here in D.C. But one of my biggest challenges was family reunification. So when I speak, I always like to speak about the fact that there needs to be more work around the visitation, that people are having access to or not having access to when they're in prison. Because I think everybody in this room already understands that helping people in prison maintain communication with their family, their children, and their communities helps them to transform their lives and be successful once they get out. But it also is beneficial for the children and the family members who are suffering through the trauma of incarceration, who need to be able to maintain their mental health by maintaining contact with their incarcerated loved ones. But then even after the person gets out, there needs to be wraparound support for the whole family, for the child, and the family members who have suffered as a result of that separation. Because just because that person comes home, their mental health, trauma, those triggers, that pain and suffering is not automatically healed. So for me, I think success looks different for everybody, but what I find with the women that I work with is that even if I get employment or I get a vehicle, not being able to regain my place as the matriarch of my family makes me feel unhealthy, and so therefore I use drugs or I make other bad decisions and I end up back in prison. So I think that, you can have all these great things in terms of housing and employment and even job training, but if your family is not healthy and you're not whole. And so I think it's really important that we continue, when we're thinking about human beings, thinking about the human beings that they're connected to and the vulnerable communities that they come from and that they're also returning to.
Can I actually make an addition to that? So reentry is not a cookie cutter process, but I really think that you have to listen to the people that are going through this phase in their life and say, what do you need, right? Get out there and ask them, because we think that there's these needs that exist, and never really reaffirming that that's in fact what you need. And so understanding, I really do believe that if you can start from a place of understanding from, if we look at you like a customer, right? A customer designed, centered focus of a need, like that sets us up when we also understand from an assessment perspective what you need to align that to resources that are available, whether it's in the criminal justice system or not.
And to that, I would add that reentry is not something that starts 6 months, a year prior to release. It really starts from day one. So as you're intaked into the system, your entire time in that system should be organized around what does it take to succeed, and what are your needs, whether they're behavioral health needs, education, training needs, and organizing a person's stay during their incarceration around productive engagement in those things. I also think in addition to the individual needs, one has to look at how society changes while an individual is away. And so the fact that you can't do anything in life now without understanding tablet technology and internet and all of that, and yet we have hundreds of thousands of people coming home. We have thousands of people coming home, many of whom have had absolutely no access to a keyboard, let alone the internet. And then also when one looks at why should we have college in prison, I just have to say this for those of you who know, for those of you who know me, we all know now that we live in a radically different world in terms of jobs and employment. 2/3 of all job openings by 2020 will require some form of post-secondary education, something beyond high school diploma or its equivalency. And so most people expect individuals to come home and get a job at a minimum. And yet we sometimes have an issue with what does it take to prepare those individuals for the kind of jobs they're coming home to, most of which are about more than a high school diploma, and many of which involve computer technology.
That's all great points. I just wanted to piggyback on something you mentioned, Lashana. Obviously you have this female perspective here, and you talked about how difficult it is, and maybe part of that was because DC is a unique place in that there is no prison here, and so family reunification, you didn't just need to emotionally reconnect, like geographically, you have to come all the way back and learn what it's like to live back in DC and back around your family. And I know, Secretary Wetzel, you work in one state and you don't have to deal with those large geographical, differences. But what can correctional facilities do to help link in those that are behind bars back with their loved ones? How can we keep those connections?
Yeah, and actually, we have a prison, like I said, 27% of people come from Philadelphia. We have a prison that's 8 hours from Philadelphia. So we deal with some of the similar issues. And let me start with this. First of all, beyond everything else, what we know is that individuals who get visits from their families in the last year are less likely to come back, right? So let's first of all start with the fact that if we're really setting up a system where we're going to get outcomes, let's start with that, right? And when you talk about, when you talked about visits and family, it's essential, right? It's essential both ways. And again, everyone is invested in people coming out and not committing another crime. And sometimes we do these false equivalents, like it's either you're about the people who are incarcerated or the victims. And it's a false comparison, right? And as we shouldn't paint individuals who come through the system the same way, we shouldn't paint victims and survivors as the same way. So I think that's an essential component that we have to keep around this. But a couple things. One, the environment in the visit room and how people are treated when they come to your prison is essential. And we do not bat 1,000% on that. I wish we did, right? But we don't. But I think that's essential. You don't want the experience, especially of a child, but anybody, to be re-traumatized by how they're spoken to or how they're treated. With that being said, some of the security stuff comes from things like people smuggling drugs in a baby's diaper, right? So again, I'm just trying to give you a balanced perspective that there's both ends of this. We have one really unique program I want to highlight. It's called FACT, Fathers and Children Together. This was a program that was developed by the lifers at SCI Greaterford. And a member of the General Assembly presented this program to me, and as you can imagine, it's a bit of a risk to start this program developed by lifers. If it goes bad, so does your career, right? I mean, that's how this thing works. But the program is really brilliant. And it's funded by the Ford Foundation, and they use art, specifically the Philadelphia mural art programs, as a vehicle to reunite fathers with their children when it's appropriate and healthy. And I say that caveat, I would assume you understand that, but someone would go, oh, well, in some cases, well, shut up, all right, come on. Okay, so when it's appropriate, and it actually funds a therapist to work with the father and their child in the visit room, using art. The visit room's just for them at that point, using art as the vehicle to start rebuilding this relationship. At the same time, the program also provides funding for the mother to not be there, right? To go shopping or do whatever. I'm not being misogynistic. I'm the father of 4 daughters. We're such a politically correct world. I got to throw all these caveats out. But just so they can focus on that relationship, and the baggage of the relationship between mom and dad isn't part of that mix. We're starting to do research around it now, but I'll tell you some anecdotes, and I hate anecdotes because anecdotes got us 2.3 million people locked up, right? But we have fathers who are incarcerated who are doing phone calls into parent-teacher conferences. That's cool stuff. If Eastern State has this exhibit on mass incarceration, and one of the people who are highlighted in that is Dewan, who got out of our prison. And when he got out of our prison, the first place he went was to his son's school. We have amazing opportunity, and visits is an opportunity. The other thing I'd say about visits and keeping people engaged is we also use that as an opportunity to understand that in our case, most of our inmates' children don't go into foster care. They go to a friend or a family member, and oftentimes we have existing programs available that they're just not aware of. So we created this thing called the Child Resource Center, and we like to label stuff, but really what it is a brochure for every program they could be eligible for, and we have it in every visit room in our system. You can, if you're from Pennsylvania, you can go to our website right now and download all the brochures. But again, I think the key is looking across agencies and find out programs that are already existing and already available to. The distance thing is difficult. I don't believe in video visitation to replace actual visitation, but to augment. I think you have to be realistic about it. And we're in the process now of trying to work with some local churches to sponsor sites. And I think the magic about that, if you pull it off, is that not only does the visit take place, but the churches have an opportunity to engage and support in other ways. The final thing I'll say is big systems, it's very difficult to get people to the prison closest to them. So we came up with a strategy that we were going to get people closer to home the closer they get to home, and then try to make decisions around that. But it's not 100%. The federal system in particular, especially females in the federal system, it's very difficult because of the distances. But again, anything that we value, we magically find a way to do it, right? I mean, if you think 20 years ago where the technology was and all the things you can do today, it's because we value that stuff, so we found out a way to do it. And magically, it didn't cost too much to be able to get the video conference with my kid 2 seconds after I walk out of here. We can afford that. So again, I think we need to stop looking at the barriers, especially from a financial standpoint, and say, look, if we really value this, then we'll find a way to do it.
Well, I want to bring you back into this conversation as well. So I just want to, building on the values and really trying to look at people as individuals, whether it's while they're in our systems or when they're coming home. And I know, Judge, at first, you sort of, I don't want to say against diversion, that's not at all what I'm trying to say, but I know that you didn't always share your views on how a judge can maybe impact mass incarceration in the way that you do now. So how did your views shift, focusing on your values and returning to your values? How were you able to make that shift, and how do you use that to get other people to see that sentencing people to harsh jail sentences isn't necessarily the best approach?
Well, thanks. It really was those 6 years I spent in the jail, and I started to see some, I think, recurring themes through that entire time. And I guess it came down to maybe some motivational interviewing with the judges, because this concept of we treat everybody the same, right? Judges, do you treat everybody the same? No, yeah, we always do. Well, wait a minute, you gave, Mary 5 days for prostitution and Susie got nothing and the other one got 90 days. Well, she had a record and she had drugs on her. Oh, so what you're really saying is you treat everybody, similarly situated the same. Yes, that's what everybody raised their hand. So then the next question is anybody similarly situated to anybody else? And nobody raised their hand, because we're really not. Nobody is similarly. So this idea of individualized sentencing structure, the individualized treatment of everybody that comes before you is very, very critical. And it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of effort. And I think for a long time, judges weren't willing to do that. I'll give you a couple other examples. Judges, how many of you have sentenced people who haven't paid their fines or costs? Everybody raise their hand. We were able to prove, without a doubt, that putting people in jail and this was before the Ferguson report came out. No, it was before. So we by executive order 5 years ago, I stopped incarcerating people for fines. We convinced the legislature to do it. And our fine, this isn't why we did it, but our fine collection actually increased when we stopped arresting people and we stopped spending money. Thank you. There was some mention about, Colorado and some of the programs. So when Hickenlooper, who's our governor now, he was mayor, when we built a new jail, which failed twice at the ballot box, we got together a group of stakeholders. How can we get this done? Well, one of the things we decided to do, obviously if you build it, they will come, they'll fill it up, and it'll all be black and brown individuals of lesser means and disadvantaged citizens, and we're just going to lock more people up. So part of the bond issue that created the jail, which was over $350 million, was a $3 million a year set aside to create a commission. And the commission was a community stakeholders. 12 of the 32 were people like myself, really in the system, prosecutors, PDs, all of that. But we also got members from the community. And we started to look at all the available programs, like things like Kim's been doing for years, and we started to see some of the benefits that we could tap into. And the thing about the bond issue was every year we put $3 million into a pot and we kept the politicians away from it. So the mayor, Michael Hancock's the mayor now, so Michael Hancock has absolutely no say in how we spend our money. And this has created just an endless amount of opportunity for us to move forward, to do things like second chance programs, and to find new outlets for the folks that we have been incarcerating all these times over and over again. I wanted to make a comment from earlier. This is just, I had a little epiphany today. So when Glenn was talking about, you know, the victim and the perpetrator. So if I take a razor blade and I cut you, I'm a criminal, right? If I take a razor blade, if someone takes a razor blade and cuts me, I'm a victim. And some of us have probably touched on this, right? Youth particularly. What are you if you cut yourself? Are you a perpetrator or are you a victim? And Glenn probably was a perpetrator one day with an armed robbery, I think is what he said, and then a couple days later he was stabbed in the neck. And is there a correlation? Is the person who cuts themselves any different than Glenn? Is he a victim or perpetrator? And so we have to start, I think one of the things we need to do is redefine how we look at everybody who comes in our system. And I came to this, my epiphany in my own court was drug-addicted prostitutes. And I know that everyone's seen the Faces of Meth. I think they stole it from us because we have a Faces of Prostitution. So we took photos, booking photos of women over a 10-year period of time. And I mean, Genevieve could have been one of the first photos, and you take a photograph of her 10 years later, and it is a completely different person. So the question that we raised in law enforcement myself was, is prostitution a victimless crime? And we all know the answer to this. It's been turned into this movement about human trafficking. But really, there's a lot of prostitutes that are victims of their own crime. They're really the victims of their own crime. And when we started to show the judges the photographs and we started to investigate the lives of those women, it was another way we were able to move the needle to get them to change their thought processes about, you know, criminal behavior. Because really, most of the folks committing the crimes have really been victims their whole lives. And so that's, and it's a tough sell, but in Colorado, we've had, I think, some pretty good success. Hope that answers your question.
It does, thank you. Yes, and so again, looking at people as individuals and focusing on the humanity of it, I'm going to turn to one of our many questions that we got. Secretary Wetzel, I'm going to direct this one at you. The question is, how do you translate treating incarcerated individuals with dignity and humanity and humanize in a correctional system down to the everyday interactions of correctional officers, especially considering the way the system is currently structured?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously hiring first in my state, civil service kind of skews that process, gives you a little less discretion, although you can build around a skill set that looks at things like communication. But I think our first real opportunity to make quick change is training. I'll give you, for instance, we really beefed up our communication skills training. And we used to do 2 hours on communication skills and 2 days on firearms qualifications. Well, I can't tell you the last time, and hopefully never, I'm looking for wood before I say this. I think that's wood, that we've had anybody who worked for the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections use a gun other than carry it, right? So I think part of it is looking at what skill set, and we can't assume the skill set. And I'll give you real specific, for instance. We got sued over our treatment of mentally ill individuals. The lawsuit alleged that we were overusing restrictive housing in response to mentally ill individuals, and this overuse was making them worse, and that came out by them self-harming and completing suicide, and they were 100% correct. That's exactly what we were doing. It wasn't a plan, it wasn't conspiracy, we just never did follow-up questions. So if someone did not follow a rule, we didn't say, oh, maybe this individual is mentally ill and this is a byproduct of his mental illness, not he just doesn't want to follow the rule. And so we transformed our mental health system. But I think the sentinel moment in that was walking through a prison and talking to some correctional officers, and they said, you know what, we've had a significant increase in number of mentally ill individuals in our system. It's about a third of our population, 29%, on our mental health roster. He said, but you've not given us the tools to deal with them. And it really struck me because, again, 100% correct. So what we did, and I'm getting to the humanizing part, is we found this training called Mental Health First Aid, which is an 8-hour training that is akin to like first aid. Doesn't make you a doctor, but it gives you some skills to wait till a medical professional gets there. So in a year, we sent all 15,000 of our staff members through that, myself included, which is I can't remember a time I sat in a classroom for 8 hours, certainly since I've been in this job. But I think that did a couple things. One, you start building a skill set, but two, we all recognize mental illness in our family, right? And getting back to that us versus them, when you start seeing things and start seeing mentally ill individuals as individuals, and it makes a difference. So I think training is a key thing. I think value is a key thing. And then I think the real practical thing, the bottom line is everybody's first interest is self-interest. And in Pennsylvania, we're going to release around 20,000 people, and they're coming back to our community. And no matter what county you live in Pennsylvania, we have 67. We have individuals going back to every one of those communities. And just so from a real practical standpoint, if they move next to you, do you want someone less likely to commit a crime or more likely to commit a crime? So I don't think it's a tough sell. I think that oftentimes, and I spent 9 years as a correctional officer, so I come from that spot, but I think that sometimes we just need to talk about it and make people draw the connection. And when people draw the connection, I think it's logical to do that, right? I think in state systems, in the federal system, one of the challenges that's not present in the jail world, and I spent 21, 22 years in the jail world, is that in jail systems, the officers and the inmates generally come from the same place. Maybe different sides of the tracks, but the same town, right? In state systems, we historically have built prisons in areas that not where the inmates come from generally, and so the cultural differences are significant. So that requires, it's not good, it's bad, it just is what it is. It's a political process. Whoever's in charge is going to get the prison in their community. That's how it works. Hopefully one day it won't work like that, but that's how it works. So then it's incumbent upon us to be more deliberate about understanding the cultural differences and taking steps to bridge the cultural gap. And again, embodying those values and continue to reinforce them.
And so a next step, like beyond the training, is to really make an impact on the day-to-day operations. And Glenn highlighted earlier today that a lot of individuals that are incarcerated don't see their future, right? And so when you have staff that have an epiphany or are re-engaging in a different way and really emphasizing culture change, in practice, when you start to highlight opportunities for people to see what their future looks like, and doing that in really tangible program delivery ways, from a treatment perspective, but from an education perspective behind the walls. I think Glenn's example was a horticulture garden in the middle of a prison, right? And so where can you take those tangible abilities for people to see where they have a future, and then start to link it up on the reentry side, start to link it up to a really kind of defined path of where they can go.
And to that, I'll add that I think in addition to training, there are two other things, and that's the selection on the front end. And we visited a jurisdiction in Germany where only 20% of the people who applied made it all the way through, and it was a 2-year training program that focused heavily on interpersonal communication skills. Remember, at the end of the day, correction officers are essentially the end-all and be-all to individuals who are incarcerated. You are reliant on a correction officer for so much. And those individuals, by and large, can't get through the day by fighting. And in many places, I know in New York City, where I worked for many years, correction officers at that time when I worked didn't have tear gas or anything, pepper spray or anything. So it really was about how do you communicate? How do you communicate successfully with up to 50 or 60 individuals and get them to comply, motivate and encourage them around taking advantage of opportunities that are there? That takes some skill, probably not the kind of skill set you can develop in a 4 to 6 week training course. And also, there's issues around support. What are the supports? Remember, I'm incarcerated as the incarcerated individual. That officer is also locked up, meaning very limited opportunities, not access to a lot of outside food and other things. And imagine that and some of the trauma and things that you see as a staff person. What are the supports for those individuals? Is it easy enough for them to go to an EAP and not be viewed as weak? So how do we support individuals who have so much power and authority and control over other individuals' lives? So that's also an important part. And then how do we develop this culture and the leadership? I'm often amazed at how people simply don't have the kind of respect for correctional leaders and correctional officers who do complex jobs. I mean, when I think about someone like Secretary Wetzel, it's managing budgets and physical plants and personnel, and it's all of the same complexities of someone who's a hospital administrator, who's a large Fortune 500 CEO. And yet I think in our minds we don't think about that in terms of corrections, the profession, and how do you support those individuals, line staff all the way through an individual like Secretary Wetzel. So I think the training is important, but so is the ongoing support and professionalism, and so is the selection on the front end. In many states, you have a high turnover of correction officers, and they're running to go and take other blue-collar type jobs that simply pay a lot more. So what happens is now you're investing in training, but then you're constantly losing those individuals to go and be truck drivers or whatever, because they have an opportunity to make more money to support themselves and their families.
And I'm so glad you brought up the staff, two things, staff wellness, because our field we're behind in a lot of ways. Staff wellness, I can't think of an area where we've done worse at just taking care of our staff. And they are the front lines. And when you have positive interactions, when staff are modeling appropriate behaviors, especially things like conflict resolution, those kinds of things, we have better outcomes. Yet we just assume that, we're paying you, so you should do this. But I just spent 2 days with Jefferson Dunn, who's the commissioner of Alabama's correctional system, and certainly they've been in the news a lot. But here's somebody who, lifelong military, Air Force, really committed to improve that system. I mean, Alabama has reduced their prison population by 3,000 over the past several years, and we're talking about 3,000 from 27,000, so pretty significant reduction. But when you talk about all these skills we want our staff to have, Alabama pays their staff next to nothing. He's having a hard time just having enough staff members to do just the basics. And when you can't do just the basics, all this stuff that we talk about, and some of our systems are fortunate in that we have some resources and we're able to pay staff a good wage and recruit staff and actually have a choice. I mean, in Germany, it's a good job. It's not like they think of it far different. You get a civil service job in Germany or Netherlands, it's the job that you aspire to. People who run prisons over there are lawyers and doctors, and I've never been accused of being either of those, trust me. But it's a different dynamic. But some of these systems, especially some of the systems in the South, when you're paying staff next to nothing. But the answer, I really think, is, again, reducing the footprint so we can afford to do this the right way. I don't think it's a matter of, the vast majority of my colleagues around the country would tell you that their values and the values of advocates and individuals who are formerly incarcerated and all these groups, the value conversation is not different. The difference is the real issues around resources and budget and making all these changes in a political environment where people have been elected forever on getting tough on crime.
Okay, LaShawna, this is a question for you. You arguably know more about the criminal justice system than anyone in this room. If you had a magic wand, what would be the first change you would make in the system? No pressure.
The audience, I was curious, say, we didn't talk about that. If I had a magic wand, I would basically do everything that we've been talking about here today and make everybody who's working in the system see the people that are incarcerated as human beings, as individuals, as people. And I think as a result of that, all the great things that we're talking about will happen. And in closing, I was just thinking, as everybody was talking, I was listening, but half of my brain was still thinking about Khalif Browder, because I watched a documentary last night. And even though I knew his story, I was surprised to learn about all of the people that was supporting him through his process, and that he was telling people what he needed and what he wanted, which was basically to get away from it all and just regroup, and that nobody was listening, from Jay-Z to Rosie O'Donnell to his therapist, his counselor, and even his family members. Nobody actually heard what he was saying. And I just wanted to go back to that point where we say, if you want to know what people's needs are when they're incarcerated or when they're returning from incarceration, just ask them and listen, and they will tell you.
How are we doing on time? 5 minutes. Okay, sorry. There are a couple more questions from the audience that unfortunately we won't be able to get to them all. But I want to, yes, you can absolutely comment on that.
This will just be a very brief comment about what you just talked about. So, in terms of listening, we started a program in Denver, and we talked a little bit earlier about CIT, so Crisis Intervention Training, right? And we've started a co-responder program. So the cops are crisis intervention trained, and they get to the scene, and they're able to determine whether or not a person's in crisis. And then they call the co-responders. And a co-responder is a social worker, mental health worker, teamed up with a police officer that's stressed down. And so then they intervene. So let's say it's trespass at 7-Eleven, guy's panhandling, now he's been back 3 times and they're gonna arrest him. This is an unbelievable statistic. The first 1,300 contacts, which would have resulted in arrests, citation or arrest, or both, 65 arrests out of the first 1,300 they contacted. So we're going now from 2 teams of co-responders to 12, which that doesn't sound like a lot, but Denver's only got 600,000 people. And so the use of this, if they just listen to the people on the street, maybe we won't have to listen to them in the Department of Corrections. So.
Thank you. Thank you, Judge. So I want to close by asking all of the panelists one final question, and then we'll just go down the line. How do you define the purpose of incarceration? How do we ensure purpose matches our practice? Carrie, you want to start with that one?
I was going to defer to Secretary Wetzel on this one, but I think that just reiterating some of the comments here throughout the day and today is that there are reasons why people have to be incarcerated, but I think that you also have to treat that in a way of recognizing that people do need to be rehabilitated, right? Over 90% of people will come back, and I want the person that lives next to me that's criminally involved to not commit another crime. Do you mean? So I think there are reasons people go into prisons, but I think that they also need to understand that most of the people are going to walk out the door.
For me, it's real simple. When someone becomes criminally involved, I think what we all want is that whenever they leave the system, they're less likely to commit a crime. Implicit in that is that we need to make good decisions. So first, we have to understand what the root cause of the crime is. And if it's addiction, just throwing them in jail is not going to address that, right? But then I think it's incumbent upon a system, and this is what we don't do, to put them on the path that's most likely to achieve that goal of having them less likely to commit a crime, right? And that's where, you hear the talks about mandatory minimums, which are rearing their ugly heads again here in Pennsylvania, where I'm in a little op-ed battle with district attorneys, who I'm good buddies with, actually, so it's rather fun on my end. It won't be fun if that passes, though. It'll cost us $85 million more for no additional public safety, but I'm just saying. But the reality is that if we designed a system that attempted to do that, that when someone became criminally involved, we identified what the root cause of the crime, and we put them on a path to not commit another crime, our population would be significantly lower.
I think is it working? Yeah. You know, I fight with judges all the time about, you know, pulling data and statistics and evidence-based practices, you know, and then we can just feed everybody into a computer and it's going to spit it out. You know, if Google can figure out what kind of cheese I'm likely to buy next week, right, by what I've done in the past, you know, I really, I mean, seriously, and, you know, pulling the data and paying attention to it and not ignoring it, I think is something that we need to keep doing. You know, we found in our SMART pretrial, when we started to release people that we didn't used to release, our releases are up 480% on PR bonds before, but we're finding some weird statistics, some weird characteristics that are likely to show a person's more likely to reoffend. This car break-in thing that we all minimized earlier a little bit, those people are very dangerous. They really are. I mean, we're starting to see just some weird anomalies in pulling the statistics, and I think it'll drive us in the future. It's a computer world, but that's where the answers are.
So in deference to Vera's ongoing Reimagining Prison initiative, I will not answer the question because we're asking stakeholders, and I want to involve all of you as members of the public as well. Go to the Vera website. But we're asking essentially, what's the purpose of incarceration? What do we intend to accomplish? And then also based on that, how should our system look like if you were in 2040 building from scratch? And so I don't want to sort of prejudice folks with my own view, but I think you know a little bit about it because I work with Vera and the things I've talked about. But essentially, that's what Reimagining Prison is all about. And in the fall of this year, we hope to produce this transformative vision where we answer the questions based on this comprehensive input from folks at all parts of the system and from general citizens, like what is it that we seek to do when we incarcerate?
I think the way we're currently using the prison system is to deal with social problems like drug abuse and mental health problems and even sex trafficking. I think that we should be using it as a form of punishment and also as a means to rehabilitate individuals because the majority of the individuals are coming from communities that are disenfranchised, dealing with all sorts of systemic violence. And in order for those, I feel like I was one of those people that needed to go to prison. I wasn't. A lot of my peers were victims of sexual abuse or domestic violence, and they ended up in prison because of the mill that they was involved with, and they were on conspiracy cases and things of that nature. I was immersed in a life of crime, so I needed to be removed from my environment, and I needed to be introduced to some new norms and some new values. So I feel like our system should be used for the purpose of rehabilitating people and giving people access to opportunities that they inherently deserve and access to resources so that they can transform their lives because I would love to see us move towards a restorative justice model because people who are in prison really do empathize with victims the same way a lot of victims do empathize with people in prison, but I think that we're afraid of it because it's so touchy-feely, it's so emotional, it's dramatic, and that's what I would love to see our prison system look like in America, moving towards restorative justice and transformation and giving people opportunities who've never had opportunities before.
Thank you all so much. Please join me in giving everybody here a big round of applause.